That I can't be here to preach this morning. I'm teaching this very second at Faith Seeking Understanding. But you are in for a great treat today. Kerry Persichitte is going to be preaching. As you know, she's our new NextGen Director. And under her leadership, we have grown our program from 6 to something like 60 kids on average every week. But the reason I've asked Kerry to come and speak today is because she was pivotal in the creation of 2 or 3 huge brand new churches that started. One downtown Willow Creek in Chicago, and the other one is Liquid Church in New Jersey. I know you're in for a great treat. Will you please give a warm Burlingame welcome to Kerry Persichitte.
Well, good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. Some energy in the room. Well, welcome to BurlPres. We are so glad that you have chosen to spend a part of your Sunday with us. And if you're new with us, we're so glad that you're here. We hope that you will find this to be the most safe and loving place in town to connect with God. And if you're watching from Facebook, from places like Las Vegas, we welcome you, and we hope that you sense the Holy Spirit with you as we sense the Holy Spirit with us here in Burlingame, California. My name, as Graham said, is Kerry Persichitte, and I am the Next Gen lead here, and that means I have the pleasure of serving kids from infancy all the way up through high school each and every week. And it is such a great opportunity for me to be here with you today because, you see, I understand how great preaching and teaching is so pivotal in the life of a church. It's what draws people to church. It's what makes church irresistible. And I bet if I could ask you, you have probably seen some fantastic teaching and preaching over the course of your lives. I know that as I've been on staffs across the country with churches, I myself have witnessed great teaching and preaching. Whether it was Lee Strobel at Willow Creek or Tim Lucas at Liquid Church. Great teaching and preaching is just one of those things that makes church irresistible. And when you think about church, most of us would agree that the sermon is indeed the biggest draw to a church, and it should be. But for today, I would like you to think about and broaden this church experience, that there is something much greater than just the sermon. The things that surround the sermon are, in fact, equally important. You see, there is a sermon being preached around the sermon each and every week in churches. Let me explain. So every Sunday, let's talk about who's showing up. We have insiders and we have outsiders.
Now again,
and insiders are the people that you would guess are the regular attenders, right? They are the members of the church. We know them. We know who they are. We know what they like. We know what songs they love and which ones they don't. We know what stories that will connect with them from the front. We also know what stories won't. We even know how you like your coffee. True. And it's really easy to design a church service for those insiders, right? But now we have a group of people called the outsiders that show up. Those are the people that are showing up to our church for the very first time. And they fall into 3 different buckets. The first is the unchurched. These are people, and I know it's really hard for you to believe, these are people that have literally never, ever stepped foot into the door of a church before. They have probably driven past churches, they've looked at churches, but they have never been in a church before. They probably have family members and friends that go to church, but they themselves have never been. And according to Barna Research, The San Francisco Bay Area tops the list as the most unchurched place in the nation. Then, our second group of outsiders, we have the de-churched. These are people that once went to church sometime in their life and no longer attend. Maybe life got too busy for them. Maybe they married somebody from a different faith tradition, and so they don't show up. Maybe they were hurt by a church before. Maybe somebody said something mean to them. And they said, you know what, I am never going back there again. Or maybe something unimaginable happened. So over the course of the last few weeks, we've been hearing about the Catholic abuse cases. And over the course of decades, somewhere, according to the New York Times, somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 kids were abused. As a NextGen director and as a mother, that literally makes me sick. And that is one reason we are doing everything we can here at BurlPres to make things safe for kids across the board. And you know what's equally tragic about this is that these people are completely de-churched. They would not want to step foot into the door of a church again. And if we are ever going to convince them that they would, we are going to have to work extra hard to overcome that pain. So, and then we have the third group. We have the church shoppers, right? And maybe these people have just literally moved to the area for the first time. They're looking for a church. Or maybe they attend a church that's somewhere in their community, but they feel God calling them to another church. And so they go church shopping. Now, I know that I'm probably talking to most of the ladies in the room, but when we talk shopping, say we are going to look for the pair of shoes, the next pair of shoes, or maybe boots. I have no idea why I mentioned that, but do we buy the very first pair that we see? No, we go shopping. We go shopping, right? We might visit 50 different stores to find that perfect pair, right, Mandy? We find that perfect pair, right? And then we may even, before we purchase, we may go back and find those 3 other top contenders just to make sure. Okay? So that is what people do when they go church shopping. And in fact, we even have people that window shop. Right? So you know those people in the mall, they like scan and see if something lures them into a store. That is what people do when they window shop with churches. They look at our website, right? So they can find out a lot about who we are by looking at that website. But before we go any further today, I'd like to start with a foundational principle, and that is our church believes at its core that all people matter to God. Let's say that again. Our church believes at its core that all people matter to God. We want people to be coming here to have an irresistible experience where they can experience our irresistible God. But we know that there are obstacles to creating an irresistible experience for everyone, the insider and the outsider. The first obstacle is pretty obvious. The word irresistible itself is fairly subjective, is it not? What might be irresistible to me is not necessarily what is irresistible to you. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that there is a gap between ourselves and this irresistible experience that we are trying to create for everyone. And church does not need to just be irresistible. It also needs to be relevant. And not just somewhat relevant, it needs to be highly relevant. And I know that those two words, irresistible and relevant, are pretty loaded words in the church community. Some of you may be thinking you're talking about creating a seeker-sensitive church that's going to lack depth and meaning, and that is not what I'm talking about at all. I just want to assure you. I know that there is a lot of baggage attached with the words irresistible and relevant. But hang with me a minute, because I believe that the words irresistible and relevant are actually biblical. When we see the beginning of the first church, can you imagine what that must have been like? We have people from two very different worlds coming together to create one church. We have people that are the believing Jews that have followed Orthodox law. We then also have the Gentiles who may have led a pagan sort of lifestyle, and they are trying to form one church. And as you might imagine, there would have been conflict there. There would have been conflict. And we see that James comes and he is part of the Jerusalem Council. He offers a resolution and he says, what does he say here? It is my judgment, therefore, that we choose not to make it difficult for the Gentiles. You see, the believing Jews were enforcing Jewish law on these Gentiles, and that might hinder them from coming into a relationship with God. That might have caused them fear. But James doesn't stop there. He asks, for the sake of their relationship with these believing Jews, he asks the Gentiles that they would observe those laws that are moral, and referring to Jewish food laws. James was a radical obstacle maker, or obstacle remover, and I believe we at BurlPres would like James, to become radical obstacle removers, to be people that consider that there are people outside these walls that have never been into a church before, or they've been hurt by a church before. We need to be very proactive about those obstacles and removing them. And to be honest, when outsiders think about church, maybe even our church, the words irresistible and relevant probably don't come to their minds. In fact, they may have had a negative or even a neutral experience, or something where they were at a church and there was a big blow up, and they see churches as being resistible and irrelevant. As insiders, we are guilty of thinking too much about ourselves. We design church services that we like, when in fact our call is to bring others, the insiders, into our walls, into our church, where they can begin a transforming relationship with Jesus. And to do that, we need to leverage everything that we have to reach the lost. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel badly. We all tend to create what we like and what we know. That is human nature. Some of you know that I used to lead a lot of mission trips, and I had a season where I would travel to Vietnam and go and preach, and also have VBS for kids there. And I will never forget the very first time I went in July, and I went into the jungle to teach a VBS. Now, the people were wonderful. The weather was unbearable. It was so hot. The food that I was being served was not familiar to me. And the customs were all very unfamiliar. And at the end of that VBS, we were driving back into Ho Chi Minh City, and there was a Starbucks. And I know that when you go to a foreign country, particularly when you are on a mission trip, you do everything to immerse yourself into that culture. But we are talking about a latte here. And not just any latte. We are talking about a Starbucks triple grande non-fat latte. And you could probably end that story for me. I like the familiar. We like the familiar. But if we are going to reach those that are far from God, we need to challenge ourselves to think broader and to expand our experience to a greater audience. Now, I know that we have awesome services. I love them. And I know that our intentions are good and pure, but there is a big difference between having good intentions and being intentional. We would think and act very differently. You see, great intentions must be partnered with great strategies and systems to truly become intentional. I know that we want people that are far from God to come here to BurlPres and find God. We want them to love and enjoy our services, but we actually need to move from wanting something to doing something. So what do we do? Where do we begin? How do we create an irresistible experience for everyone, the insider and the outsider, to connect with God? And I'm going to start at the very beginning. Does that sound good? Okay, so when you think about a Sunday morning, when do you think that a person's first experience with BurlPres begins? Do you think it's maybe when they grab a cup of coffee and a donut in Fellowship Hall, or maybe when they are handed a bulletin as they walk into the sanctuary or chapel? I would tell you you're wrong. The very first physical touch point a person has with our church is in the parking lot. It's in the parking lot. And now we're going to go through this experience together. I'm going to ask that you call everyone that attends our church a guest. Some of these guests you probably have known most of your lives. They're very familiar. Some of these guests, though, are friends that you've yet to meet. Right? And it's been said in the church world that the sermon actually begins and ends in the parking lot. So that might sound a little strange to you, but stay with me. Long before an outsider has ever walked through the doors of our church and heard the sermon, they have made some key decisions. They have decided what we are about long before we have the opportunity to tell them what we're about. Think about that for a minute. Now, think about your experience today as you pulled into our parking lot or into one of the parking spaces around our church. I'd like for you to consider the moment you stepped out of that door and into our church to hear the sermon. That gap of time should be called the experience before the experience. Now, the sermon that day might be amazing. Maybe not today, but the sermons here are usually incredible. Has had a negative experience in the parking lot, and they're already walking in with baggage. You've probably lost them. You see, the parking lot is one of the most important places in our church. So what can we do? It is just a parking lot, Carrie. Anyway, first, we would make it highly personal. We should have people out there greeting folks and letting them know that we are glad that they're there. This is just one example of how churches can remove obstacles. Now, we do need to greet them. We do not tell them how to park, how to drive. That could go south pretty fast. But we are there to help reset their thoughts and to help make our church experience loving and fun. And that will go a long way in removing obstacles. Now visualize moving from the parking lot into our entryways and hallways. Everything, and I mean everything, should be neat and clean. So now I would like for you to think about when you have guests to your home. So over the course of a week, we have backpacks, shoes, shopping bags that accumulate in our house, right? But when we have guests come, you know what I'm talking about. That stuff disappears immediately, right? Because we had guests coming, and that's the way we should be here at church. We remove that obstacle for them by letting them know that we expected them and that we cared. Now, when they enter, they shouldn't have a hard time finding their way around, right? I want you to think about a time when you've gotten lost. Now, I know that most men never get lost and never need directions, but we women do get lost, and it is frustrating, right? And so when you've got somebody that is walking into a church for the very first time and they can't find their way around, you've given them an obstacle, right? We can never have too much signage. I would encourage us to ask the outsider to come in and see things that we cannot. Listen and learn from them. Now, signs are great and all, but we don't want people to have that very impersonal experience, right? We do want a highly personal experience while allowing for personal space. And let me say there is a difference between highly personal and creepy personal. You know what I mean. Everyone who is a greeter to our guests should be coached on these things. We should put great people in these very prominent places, the areas where our guests first enter our church. Bottom line, greeters should never take the initiative. They should always wait on the guest to take the initiative. If they offer their hand, we shake their hand. And if you're a hugger, please refrain from hugging people you don't know. We need to make those experiences highly personal for these guests. We should have great trained people in these places and make sure that we do these things with consistency. I'd recommend that you visit some other churches that do this really, really well. I'm sure you can all think of a restaurant that you go to and they have top-notch customer service. They make you feel welcome, they know you, and they know how to greet you. Another way we can create a relevant and irresistible experience for everyone is to remember that children and students are guests too. Now, I might show a little bias here, but everyone at our church should have that irresistible and relevant experience if we are going to move people, especially families, from guest to attenders. If you're a mom or dad, you know that if we have captured the heart of your child, we have captured your family. And we also need to remember that safety matters. Parents value a safe experience over a great experience, and that's just one of the reasons that we have begun our electronic check-in system for families and for kids. We're also talking about ways that we can increase the safety in the areas when kids are in programming. Safety is so important to us. In fact, it is one of the most important things to us here at BurlPres. And we also know that kids can face another very real obstacle, anxiety. So think about it. If you are a little child and your parents are bringing you to church, and they are giving you to people that you don't know, and they are taking you to a place that you have never been before, that can create a ton of anxiety for kids. And we can usually overcome that obstacle, that anxiety, by making that experience highly personal and fun. You see, those little students and kids are important to us too here at BurlPres. And now I want to talk a little bit about our adult services. What can we do in our adult services to make them irresistible and fun for everyone? The outsider, the insider. First, make anonymity a priority. You heard me. When somebody is new to a church, they probably do not want to be bombarded, right? Especially the introverts. We should, however, make our next steps highly personal, logical, and easy to find so they know what to do and where to go when they are ready to make that movement. And we also need to make that experience guest-centric. We need to create a threaded, cohesive, comprehensible service. It does not mean that we need to water down our services. we can still have those very deep, meaningful services, but we need to explain what we are doing. Think about if you were walking into the sanctuary for the very first time, what might you want to know? You might want to know how long the service might be, what will we be doing? What is the service about? We need to make a guest-centric experience. We also need to explain what we're doing. If we are going to be celebrating like communion today, we should take the time to explain why it's so meaningful to us and how we celebrate communion. Everything needs to be comprehensible. Think if I were experiencing X for the very first time, what might I want to know about X? Make things simple to understand. So, BurlPres, we know our church is great. We know our community is great. And we know that our God is great. And as we think about the future and all of the folks outside our doors that have yet to walk into our church, how can we embrace that outsider with the same passion and intensity that our God used in pursuing us? Those that are unchurched, those that are de-churched, those that are church shopping. How can we create an irresistible and relevant experience for everyone? Now, I believe that we are getting positioned to open our doors wide, to be the most loving and safe place in town by becoming the most irresistible and relevant place in town for people to connect with God, to those who have been hurt by a church, to those who have been looking for a new church home, to those who have never once stepped foot into a church, for that sweet, curious little preschooler, for that sort of edgy, rough high schooler. Everyone should matter to us because they matter to God. And I'd like to close this morning with a why. Why is this so important to me? Well, you see, many of you know that I grew up in this area. I attended a church up the road, and although I loved God, I wasn't sure that I belonged at that church. There were some things I was wrestling with, but then one day, my friend Dory stepped into my faith journey. And she was patient with me. She answered my questions. She took step after step with me. She never pushed or forced me. She did, however, make me read a lot of books, but she did encourage me. She kept inviting me time and again to her church services. And once I got there, I, the outsider, experienced an irresistible church experience. And I said to myself from that day on, I am going to do everything I can, spend my life creating an irresistible, helping churches create irresistible experiences like I experienced an irresistible church experience. I can't wait to see what God has in store for BurlPres and to see how the lives of those outsiders will be changed for eternity. And when I have the opportunity to teach your kids and your grandkids, I look around the room and I wonder who is sort of sitting on the outlines, who is feeling a little bit like an outsider, who in God's timing will be called to lead the next generation here at BurlPres.